Brooks, how about you start? We'll start with IU football's. We'll how about we trade our safest position groups for IU football, who we think is, no matter what, going to be absolutely fine. If Indiana falls off the rails and goes 3-9 this year, it's not going to be because of which position group.
I think it's the wide receivers. I know they lose guys in Omar Cooper Jr. and Elijah Surratt, but then again, you have Charlie Becker returning, and Charlie Becker, I don't even want to say he had a great season entirely. He had a great end of the year, and that's really what matters. The Hoosiers went 16-0, and Charlie Becker really emerged in that Penn State game. I remember being there, and just the impact he had when Elijah Surratt was, the wide receivers rather, in bad ways in Penn State. I don't even think Elijah Surratt played in that Penn State game, actually, but Omar Cooper Jr. made that insane catch, but Charlie Becker, the unsung hero of that game, Omar Cooper Jr. gets a lot of the credit for that one. He also had insane catches in the Big Ten championship game against Ohio State. He's 6'4". He made plays in the national championship, notably that fourth down. And I think he is going to be a guy who is just one of the best in college football, maybe top 5 wide receivers in college football. And then on the other side of the line, on the other side of the offense, you have Nick Marsh, the transfer from Michigan State. He stands at 6'3" as well, and he's a yards after catch type of receiver. So if there's any type of safe position group, I have a lot of confidence in this wide receiver core. And I think it really stems from those two guys. And I know you talked a lot about this third guy I'm going to bring up, and I'll give the floor to you, Andrew, but Tyler Morris as well. We didn't see him at all last year, and in this spring game, he slowly started to practice at the end of the year going into the playoffs, but we didn't see him at all. This spring game, he had a massive game. So him being that guy in the slot, too, I think it gives Josh Hoover a lot of options, especially with a very good offensive line.
Absolutely. You make a good point. And yeah, Tyler Morris, I think, he's kind of becoming one of my more favorite players, I guess, on this team, just almost from a human interest perspective, because and I wrote about this for the Hoosier Network, so I won't go deep into it, but you can find that at thehoosiernetwork.com. It's my most recent football story. It's on Tyler Morris. He won a national championship in Michigan, but he was kind of, in the ensemble, right? He wasn't the leading receiver, and the receiving core wasn't the most important aspect of that offense. Obviously, they leaned a lot on their running backs. On that team that won the national championship was J.J. McCarthy. And then you're absolutely right. Transferred to Indiana. This was the time he was going to step into kind of a starring role last year. And then, pretty much a catastrophic injury in spring. He's out for the entire season, as you mentioned. And now he's back. And Indiana won a national championship without him. According to Charlie Becker, he told us in media availability in the spring that Tyler Morris was still very vocal on the, in practice, on the sideline, that sort of thing over the course of the season, the previous season when Indiana won the national championship. And now he's here and probably going to start in the slot. He did catch a touchdown pass in that critical Michigan postseason run, I believe in the Rose Bowl that would have been back a couple of years ago against Alabama. And Tyler Morris is going to be awesome, and you make a good point about the receivers. And if Josh Hoover is going to acclimate quickly and he's going to get up to speed really quickly for Indiana, I'm sure who he's throwing to is going to have a great deal to do with that. And something else offensively that's going to have a great deal to do with that is the running back game. I'm a huge lover of being able to lean on a rushing attack, right? When you have a young quarterback in the NFL is normally where this comes to mind for me, but also when you have a transfer quarterback like Indiana and someone in Josh Hoover who's a little bit less proven than maybe some of the other quarterbacks in the Big Ten or in college football across the board. And you bring in Hoover, and he's got that running game, in theory, to lean on. And I'm glad that we interpreted this question a little bit differently, because you went in the direction of what was successful during the actual game season last year, and I'm a little bit more influenced by recency bias, so I'm going off of what I saw in the spring game. And the running backs, I mean, you mentioned Tyler Morris in the spring game. You were absolutely right about that. Also, the running backs were kind of a headlining act in the spring game. Turbo Richard was awesome. Kobe Martin was awesome. This team will get Lee Beebe Jr. back as well, who's awesome as a returner. Turbo Richard comes in from Boston College. Kobe Martin also returns, although he was less regularly in the rotation last season. He looks awesome now, though. And Turbo Richard is exactly what he sounds like. That's his name for a reason, I suppose. And he was awesome in the spring game. If you just go back and watch the spring game, it felt exactly like to me, the national championship game, and this is what I mean when I talk about being able to lean on a nice run game, is where against Miami, it felt, I would have to go back and actually look at the EPA per play and stuff like that, but it felt like when I was in Assembly Hall and I'm watching on the Jumbotron, and it felt like Kalen Black for 7 yards was just such a regular occurrence over the course of that game. And if Indiana was ever in trouble, or if it was ever in doubt for whether or not Indiana was going to go win that national championship game, Roman Hemby for 6 yards, and then all of a sudden it's a deep breath and everything feels okay, whether it's a first down or just it, presents a second or third and short yardage situation. And I think Indiana is going to have that same presence again in the running back room. So certainly, clearly against pretty much anyone and anything, because we know how great that Miami defensive front was, it seems to be that Indiana's not going to have a run game just completely fall out from under it, and the floor is not going to completely fall out from under the offense. And if Josh Hoover is completely in peril, it's not going to be because he doesn't have running backs to hand the ball off to.
Also, I want to look at the past three national champions, Michigan, Ohio State, and Indiana. All three of those teams had a very good number of running backs. It was a running back by committee. It wasn't just one guy. Last year for Indiana, you mentioned Roman Hemby and Kalen Black. Those guys, they were kind of trading reps here, and Indiana now has three guys, Turbo Richard, Lee Beebe Jr., and obviously Kobe Martin. So they can do it by committee. Ohio State, Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, Michigan, Blake Corum, and Donovan Edwards. So you need those guys in that running back room. And I agree with you. I think Indiana has those guys. They have the talent. And also, they're coming off of a national championship. They know what the expectations are. And again, I talked about it with the wide receivers. You mentioned it here. But this Indiana offensive line is really, really, really good. And when you have an offensive line that you can hide behind, that's not really the way I want to present it, but you can lean on that offensive line. I think it's just that position group is just gonna be so good because they have that constant common denominator of a great offensive line, both for the wide receivers, for Josh Hoover, for this entire offense. This offensive line is really, really, really good.
Absolutely. You'll notice with my most concerning position group pick that it's really hard to find a flaw kind of on this team. And you comb through the roster and you see, and this is why obviously you look at Indiana as a team that's going to be back towards the top of the Big Ten championship and national championship conversation, because you have a roster that already returns so much, and then you just supplement everything that could possibly be in question through the transfer portal. And then you keep in mind that there's a recruiting class that, if it's not awesome and amongst the elite, it's at least building upon where Indiana was previously. So this program will be at the top for quite a long time. And obviously the running backs, the offensive line, the receivers, all a part of that. But let's talk about the most concerning as well. Let's talk about some doomsday worst case scenarios for Indiana, because as we mentioned, it's going to be pretty difficult we could just come on this podcast and just talk about how awesome all these position groups are, and we'd have great success doing so. But let's find the other side. Let's find the dark side of the conversation. I'll let you go first because I think mine is much more controversial in this category. Most concerning position group: if Indiana falls apart completely and goes 1-11 this season, which position group do you think you'd point to first?
Well, I hate that this is all offense, but I'm going to go with the tight ends. Riley Nowakowski and Holden Staes, they're gone, and they had great years for Indiana. Now you have to rely on Brock Schott, the transfer from Miami, who was already nursing an injury when he transferred to Indiana, Andrew Barker, and Blake Thyre. So, these are three guys who aren't proven at all. And tight ends, they really do it all. They're gadget guys. They block, they catch the passes, and they're driving this offense forward. And they're essentially, an extension of the offensive line at times. So when you have guys who haven't really seen the field, especially stepping into the reigning national championship winning offense, I think it can create some problems. And that's just something that Indiana's going to have to feel out. We talk about, this early season schedule where Indiana, opens the season against North Texas. They play Howard, Western Kentucky. Those are essentially tune-up games to get ready for the season. That's when we are really going to learn a lot about this offense and about the team in total. But the tight end in that position group really worries me because we don't know anything about.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of the running game in the sense that, you can win a championship without a good tight end group, but that supplemental aspect of, just also having, it's kind of what makes teams unfair, is when you just also have a great tight end on top of everything else. And sometimes what Indiana might find, I don't think they'll find it with the running backs, but maybe, as you mentioned, they'll find it with the tight ends, is by the time you get to the national championship game and you don't have those 27-yard Riley Nowakowski catches out of nowhere anymore, you start to notice that in the margins of the contest a little bit more. My most concerning is, I'm not actually concerned about this position group, but I wanted to use this position group in case there's a worst case scenario, so that if Indiana does fall off the rails and goes 7-5, then I'll at least have said something about it in July. I put quarterback at my most concerning, and which is completely illogical and offensive to say, more than likely, considering Josh Hoover and what he brings to the table. But he comes in from TCU, and again, it's hard to find a real flaw in a reigning national championship team that covered most of its bases in the transfer portal. But because of the possible worst case scenario that could occur here with Josh Hoover, this is where I'm going with this pick. You mentioned the tight ends, and you mentioned how we have this team has to some degree an easier schedule to begin with, as most teams do. And there's a real possibility that this team looks perfect and looks awesome for 3, 4, 5 weeks. Even at the beginning of Big Ten play, you have Northwestern and Rutgers there at the start. And then in October, this team goes, I believe I have this order correct, but to Nebraska, and then home against Ohio State, and then back on the road against Michigan. If it's not in that order, it's those 3 games out those locations, back to back to back, with no bye week in between. And that's the stretch where, if there are turnover issues with Josh Hoover that maybe haven't had the opportunity to be resolved quite in the same way as maybe they normally would if Indiana started with a really good team in week 1, because Indiana's winning by 30 and maybe these opposing teams just aren't quite as great at capitalizing off of turnover-worthy plays, then maybe we get to a point where it's October and 1, 2, or even worst-case scenario where the season could be over with 3 losses, where you have a few costly interceptions here or there, or if there's health issues, obviously there's that as well. And then you also bring in the fact you're bringing in a transfer receiver in Nick Marsh. You're bringing in the transfer for quarterback. There could be some chemistry issues early on. They'll have plenty of time to make it work and to kind of work out those kinks. But also on the flip side of that, if you want to talk about worst case scenarios, there's a lot of time for Indiana to kind of build up the perception that everything's fine. This is another 16-0 national championship team. And then maybe Nebraska springs an upset. They'll probably also be undefeated at that time. Maybe Ohio State's undefeated. I know they have Texas, but also a potential undefeated versus undefeated situation. I'll admit I'm not intimately knowledgeable on Michigan's first half of the season schedule, but potentially that's a team that also has only a loss or 2 at that time as well. And then if all of those flaws are exposed, then perhaps, again, 1 loss could be all it takes. 1 loss could be all it takes to knock Indiana to, or 2 losses could be all it takes to knock them out of the Big Ten championship game. 1 loss could be all it takes to make a Big Ten championship game loss, which was perfectly reasonable to suggest last year. 13-10 was the final score, and even more so this year, considering that Ohio State's going to be back and Oregon's going to be back and all of these teams are going to be back. To where 2 losses, maybe they're still in the playoff, but now you're going on the road against LSU, and the season looks a whole lot different. And this is why we love college football. The margin for error could be so small, and it's not like Josh Hoover necessarily led a perfect team last season at TCU. I believe that team went 8-4. Regardless, I have full faith in Josh Hoover. I think it's going to be fine. We had turnover concerns about Fernando Mendoza a year ago. Everything was fine. We didn't think that Fernando Mendoza was potentially going to win the Heisman Trophy necessarily. I don't know how many of us were predicting that. We thought he was going to be good, and just like Josh Hoover this year for a lot of people, we just didn't think that good. And so maybe Hoover steps into that good territory, and because of Cignetti and the coaching staff and the quarterback's coach and everyone involved, I think that's more likely going to be the case. But if we want to talk about most concerning, and there's a worst-case scenario in play, I went with quarterback just because of the unknowns involved.
Yeah, I wrote an article, pretty much an in-depth article, introducing Indiana fans about who Josh Hoover is, not only as a quarterback, as a person, but also kind of comparing him to Fernando Mendoza, essentially with the stats. And I know a lot of people bring up those turnover concerns. He threw 13 interceptions in less games than Fernando Mendoza played. Fernando Mendoza only threw 7 interceptions. And I think those turnover concerns are definitely valid for Indiana fans. But also remember, this is what many consider, I consider it, the best coaching staff in the entire country. They, like you said, Fernando Mendoza, he also had some concerns going into the year, And obviously, he came out of Bloomington, the most polished quarterback that Indiana fans have ever seen. He went #1 overall, Heisman Trophy winner. So I have no doubts that the coaching staff has definitely addressed those problems. Josh Hoover faced 35% more pressure than Fernando Mendoza did all year. It was a worse offensive line. He's inheriting a better offensive line, a better wide receiver core, a better culture. Josh Hoover, he has probably the most difficult job in all of college football. He has to be the guy after Fernando Mendoza. Indiana fans all over the country idolize Fernando Mendoza, and he is the guy who is taking over. And I think that is the most difficult situation to throw a quarterback into because of the expectations and the pressure that are going to be on Josh Hoover. I do agree, if he can't figure it out, there could be the noise can get pretty loud, especially with these Indiana fans who are coming to college football for the first time the past couple of years, and now they have such high expectations. I mean, we see it all the time with Indiana basketball. These fans, they've been watching for 10, 20, 30 years, maybe even more, probably more, and they have such these lofty expectations where if they're not met, something is wrong. Somebody needs to be held accountable. And the quarterback and the coach are always the first ones to get any type of that pushback, that flack. And Curt Cignetti isn't going to get any of that because of what he just did last year. Josh Hoover wasn't here last year, so I think a lot of that is going to fall on, Josh Hoover and his shoulders. So I think he has the most pressure in all of college football. I think he has the most difficult job in college football. But I do have a lot of faith in Josh Hoover. He ran the RPO the second most amount of times, only second to Fernando Mendoza. He knows how to run the offense. And we've slowly started to see more and more of Josh Hoover. In that spring ball, we saw him throwing. We saw him in the spring game. I think it's just going to take a little bit of time, but that's why Indiana has the benefit of this easier non-conference schedule where they can go into these games. We can learn more about Josh Hoover, but also he can feel this out against a team that's not, the other Indiana practice squad. So I think Josh Hoover has a difficult job, and I think there are a lot of lofty expectations on him, but time will tell what happens to number 10 in Bloomington.
Absolutely. And speaking of that pressure, the other point I forgot to mention is that kind of like Mendoza, and there's some people on ESPN that might still say things like this about Mendoza, but we don't know what Hoover is necessarily like in those big games. And so if you put these two ideas in a parlay, it probably wouldn't hit. But it's totally reasonable to say that maybe there are some flaws and some cracks under the surface for Indiana that aren't exposed until they play a good team. And when they do play that good team, maybe they lose that game. Very, normal to say when you're playing against Ohio State, Nebraska on the road, Michigan on the road. So a loss in the regular season, obviously, is totally reasonable. It's also totally reasonable to say that we don't know what Hoover's like in big games, and maybe once you get to the Big Ten championship game and it's the Dante Moore revenge game, or it's the Ohio State revenge game, or whatever it may be, maybe there's a loss there too. And then again, it's still a playoff team in theory, but that's a 2-loss playoff team, 11-2 or whatever, that maybe is, the 10 seed and is going on the road against LSU or on the road against whoever it might be. That's obviously a totally different situation than Indiana was in a year ago. It doesn't take much to completely go from, we saw it all of last year. It was kind of like, at least for me, I was almost bewildered, kind of thinking, is Indiana actually going to be the 1 seed this entire rest of the season once they were crowned number 1? And it was normal. I don't know if it was almost more crazy that Indiana was an undefeated 1 seed, just the 1 seed at the Rose Bowl, than it was that they converted that into an actual national championship. But 1 loss, 2 losses, and that just, it all flips, and it all, even without just the conference champions needing to be the top 4 seeds, it all flips, and that team could have dropped multiple pegs, and who knows if they win the national championship the same way with a different path. They probably do. I felt like that was a team of destiny, but this season it could be a different story. But ultimately, I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of a cop-out to say most concerning position group and then say I have full faith in this position group, but that's what you have to do when you're talking about a defending national champion.